Why do you think this political persecution against Lula is something that everybody should be concerned about?
Well, I think, as your audience probably knows, this is the second stage of a coup that started, of course, with the impeachment of Dilma. So she was impeached without really a crime, and now you have another former president who's being sent to prison without evidence. These are two aspects of the same process whereby the people who never really accepted the Workers' Party as a legitimate government, which is the traditional elite of Brazil and the media, of course, which is part of this, they're taking what they couldn't win for 14 years at the ballot box. They're getting it back. And so that, I think, is the main thing that's going on. And, you know, in the process, of course, they're weakening the rule of law. They've pretty much destroyed the independence of the judiciary in these kinds of political cases. And they're really creating a different, much more limited form of democracy where they get to decide not only if a president can stay in office, but if another candidate, a former president, can run, who can run in the election. So it's really a more limited form of democracy, and it's even more dangerous than that. I mean, obviously there's a lot that's reminiscent of the 1964 coup. You have this violence, you know, on March 27th, Lula's caravan was shot at March 17th. You had Marielle Franco, who, the city councilor in Rio, who was assassinated. It was a real political assassination, and don't see the government doing much to investigate it. So this is getting more and more like not only a limited form of democracy, but something that looks more and more like violence and repression could play a greater role in the way these people govern.
In the specific case of Lula, do you think that the U.S. has any role in that sense?
Yes, I do. I mean, this is, you know, it's funny how the U.S. role is never discussed in the international media when they talk about Latin America. I mean, Latin America is going through this huge transformation. You know, it became more independent of the United States than it had ever been for 500 years in the 21st century, and now it's going back in the old direction, back to the 20th century. And, you know, to talk about these changes without the United States is kind of like talking about Ukraine and not mentioning Russia. And I think that, you know, of course they're involved. I mean, you know, it's interesting. Lula was asked this question on Democracy Now!, and the first thing he said was, well, it took us 40 years to find out what the U.S. did in the coup in 1964. And so a lot of this won't come out. But you do have plenty of evidence. You have, of course, you know, the evidence of the U.S. support for the impeachment of Dilma, which we've talked about before, where, you know, they came, where the Aloysio Nunes, the head of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee in Brazil, came here just 2 or 3 days after the coup and met with Tom Shannon, the number 3 person in the State Department. And there were things like that, other meetings, you know, John Kerry's press conference in front of the embassy, the U.S. Embassy on August 5th with José Serra. These were ways, and the things he said about the great future they were going to have. There's ways of making sure everyone knew that the U.S. supported the coup. Now, the impeachment, and, well, of course I call it a coup. Now, the second phase, the persecution of Lula. And there you see the U.S. is obviously involved in the investigations, the Department of Justice, for example, the acting attorney, Assistant Attorney General Kenneth Blanco, he was at a talk here in July of 2017, and he said it's hard to imagine a more cooperative relationship in recent history than that of the U.S. Department of Justice and the Brazilian prosecutors. And then, just a little bit later in his same speech, he bragged about how the prosecutors in Brazil won a guilty verdict against former President Lula of Brazil. So he's very happy about this, and he's not trying to hide it at all. And so I think, it will take some investigation to find out exactly what they did. But if you look at their attitude towards Brazil, and they never wanted the PT from the very beginning, and all the things they've done over the years, of which I've just mentioned, scratched the surface. I mean, you had, so much history, which we can go into if you wanted, in the whole 14 years of the Workers' Party, and even when Lula was running for election in 2002. So you have a lot of motive here, and you have opportunity, because here they are involved in the investigation with the, with Sergio Moro. And what are they doing? Are they there just to make sure it's an impartial investigation? I don't think so. I think they're part of the U.S. government, and they're doing what the other parts of the U.S. security state, as it's called euphemistically, is doing. So yeah, I think they're involved, and I think we'll get more evidence. Hopefully we can get some investigation here of what they're actually doing.
What getting Lula in jail will mean to Brazil and to Latin America and to progressivists everywhere?
Well, I think most immediately this imprisonment of Lula and using the judicial system to prevent him from running for president, to prevent the Workers' Party from coming back to power, that they're trying to do. I think it obviously has a terrible effect on any kind of democracy, And of course, it's also, it's not just the abstract democracy, it's what they want to do with the power, right? And we see what the right is doing in terms of the cuts in social spending, the attempt to cut pensions, education. So it's the usual right-wing agenda to criminalize the MST, for example. And so there's that. And then it's also a part of what's happening in Latin America. There's been this huge shift to the right, and as I said, a loss of national sovereignty and independence. And here you see the U.S. using these new right-wing governments in that they've helped to get there, and they've helped in Argentina. They've intervened in Argentina quite a bit to worsen Argentina's balance of payments problems, for example, by blocking loans at the World Bank and the Inter-American Development Bank, and then restoring the U.S. support for that after Macri took office, and then you had, the U.S. Judicial system, like in Brazil, but in the U.S. it was being used internationally. The U.S. judicial system was used to exacerbate the balance of payments problems in Argentina as well, when the New York court ruled that the Argentina's creditors could not be paid until the vulture funds were paid. So they did all these things, and then of course they lifted all the things they did to Argentina when they had the right-wing government. And you can go through country by country. Obviously Venezuela is the most prominent example. There you have the U.S. openly calling for a military coup and doing everything they can possibly do to make sure that actually happens. They have financial sanctions against the country, which are illegal under the OAS Charter and other international conventions that the U.S. is a signatory to. And they're trying to strangle the country economically. They're even threatening further sanctions. And right now, nobody even knows about this because the media has barely reported. I think Reuters reported in the United States, and they're pretty much the only one that's paying attention to it. The U.S. is actually trying to prevent a presidential election from taking place because they want a coup. And, you know, even if their candidate, even if an opposition candidate would win, they don't even want to take a chance on that because they want their candidate. And so this is the state you've gotten to when you have right-wing, and not only right-wing, but really pro-U.S. governments. I mean, you know, Brazil, Argentina, Colombia. Santos was independent for a while when you had other independent governments, and now all of these governments have become subservient to U.S. foreign policy in the hemisphere in ways that haven't been in decades. And you haven't had anyone like Luis Almagro at the Organization of American States for decades either. He's got a fanatical crusade against Venezuela, and he's even supporting further oil sanctions against Venezuela. And so this is something, and you've got Mexico as well, which used to have an independent foreign policy, even going all the way back to the Russian Revolution. And, you know, and they were practically the only country that refused to cooperate with the U.S. on Cuba after the Cuban Revolution. So, and they're in the pocket of the U.S. foreign policy establishment now as well. So this is a huge rollback that the U.S. used the terminology of the Cold War, because that's what it's always been as far as they were concerned. That was the plan from 20 years ago. Just get rid of every left government that you can get rid of. And that's what they're trying to do right now.